The old school building, tucked away in a quiet town, had been standing for over a century. Despite its history, it was still functional and filled with students daily. But there was one room no one dared to enter. Room 206. Whispers among the students claimed that a terrible event had taken place there years ago. And since then, the room had been sealed off. The stories ranged from ghostly apparitions to objects moving on their own. However, one night, a group of curious students decided to uncover the truth behind the mysterious room. Late one evening, when the hallways were empty and the lights dimmed, the group sneaked into the school. They made their way to the second floor, hearts pounding with both fear and excitement. Standing before the locked door of room 206, they hesitated. "Are we really doing this?" whispered Emily, the most nervous of the group. "We have to," replied Jake, trying to sound confident. With a deep breath, they picked the lock and pushed the door open. The room was pitch black, but as they stepped inside, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. As they explored the room, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped suddenly, causing them to shiver. The door they had entered through slammed shut on its own, locking them inside. Panic set in as they fumbled for their flashlights. When they finally turned them on, they gasped. The desks and chairs were arranged in a bizarre, chaotic pattern. The chalkboard had fresh writing on it, even though no one had been in the room for years. The words spelled out, "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." The students realized they had made a grave mistake. In their fear, they recalled the rumors about the room's dark past. Years ago, a teacher had gone mad and locked herself in room 206 after a tragic incident involving a student. She was never seen again, but her screams were heard echoing through the halls for days. Some said her spirit never left, trapped within the room. The students tried to rationalize what was happening, but the fear was too strong. They needed to find a way out, but the door wouldn't budge. The room seemed to be closing in on them, and the air grew thick with tension. Jake tried to force the door open while the others searched for another exit, but there was none. As they frantically searched, they noticed a shadowy figure moving in the corner of the room. It was the silhouette of a woman, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "She's here," whispered Emily, her voice trembling. The figure moved closer, and the temperature dropped even further. Desperate, they started banging on the walls, hoping someone would hear them. But the school was empty. It was just them and the ghostly presence that seemed to be growing stronger by the second. The figure took shape, revealing the ghastly appearance of the long-deceased teacher. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth twisted into a silent scream. She raised a hand, and the students felt an invisible force pushing them back. "You shouldn't be here," a cold, disembodied voice echoed around them. "You've disturbed my peace." The room began to spin, and the students struggled to stay on their feet. Jake managed to grab a chair and throw it at the door in a final act of desperation. The chair shattered, but the door remained intact. The situation was becoming increasingly hopeless. As the ghostly teacher advanced, the walls of the room seemed to close in, warping and distorting as if the room itself was alive. "You need to leave," the ghost hissed, her voice filled with malice. But there was no escape. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the students felt a suffocating pressure on their chests. Emily screamed as she felt icy fingers brush her shoulder. "We're sorry," she cried. "We didn't mean to disturb you." But the ghost was relentless. "Leave now," it repeated, "or you'll never leave." The students knew this was their final warning. In a last-ditch effort, Jake noticed a small window near the ceiling. "There!" he shouted, pointing it out. They quickly formed a makeshift ladder out of the broken chairs and desks. One by one, they climbed up to the window, struggling to push it open. As they did, the ghost's presence became more aggressive, the room shaking violently. Emily was the last to climb up, and just as the ghost reached out to grab her, she squeezed through the window. They tumbled onto the cold, hard ground outside, gasping for air. The school loomed ominously behind them, silent once more. The students ran home, terrified and shaken to their core. They swore never to speak of that night again, but the experience haunted them. Nightmares plagued their sleep, and they avoided the school's second floor at all costs. Rumors continued to circulate about room 206, but no one dared to enter it again. The door was once more locked, and the key mysteriously disappeared. The school returned to its normal routine, but the students who had ventured into room 206 knew the truth. The ghost of the teacher still lingered there, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to disturb her. As time passed, the legend of room 206 became just another ghost story to scare new students. But those who had been inside knew better. The fear was real. And so was the ghost. They had narrowly escaped with their lives, and the memory of that night stayed with them forever. The school remained a place of learning during the day, but at night the shadows lengthened, and the air grew cold. Room 206 stood as a silent reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some secrets are better left buried. The playground behind the school was a favorite spot for students to hang out, especially after classes. However, there was one area everyone avoided: the old, rusty swing set. It was said that a little girl had died there years ago, and ever since, the swings would move on their own, even on windless days. The teachers dismissed it as a trick of the wind, but the students knew better. They whispered about seeing a ghostly figure of a girl, her dress fluttering in an unseen breeze, watching from the shadows. One night, a group of friends decided to investigate. As the sun set, the group gathered at the edge of the playground. The air was cool, and the sky darkened quickly. "I don't know if this is a good idea," said Mark, nervously glancing at the swings. "What if it's true?" Sarah, the bravest of the group, shrugged. "We'll never know if we don't check it out." With flashlights in hand, they approached the swing set. The swings were still, but as they got closer, they began to creak and sway. A chill ran down their spines as they realized the swings were moving on their own, just like the story said. As they stood frozen, the temperature dropped sharply and a fog began to roll in from the surrounding woods. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the eerie creaking of the swings. Suddenly, a soft giggle echoed through the playground, sending shivers down their spines. "Did you hear that?" whispered Jenny, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, a shadowy figure appeared near the swings. It was a small girl, her form barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes glowed a pale blue, and she stared at the group with an unsettling smile. They realized, with a sinking feeling, that the ghost was real. The ghostly figure began to walk towards them, her feet barely touching the ground. The group backed away slowly, too frightened to run. "Who are you?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The ghost stopped and tilted her head, as if considering the question. "I used to play here," she said softly, her voice echoing as though coming from far away. "But now I'm stuck. Will you play with me?" The friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. The air grew colder and the fog thickened, making it hard to see. The ghost's request sounded innocent, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Mark, trying to keep his composure, shook his head. "We can't. We have to go home." The ghost's smile faded, replaced by a look of sadness. "But I'm so lonely," she said, her voice quivering. The swings creaked louder, and the chains rattled as though being pulled by invisible hands. "Stay and play, just for a little while," the ghost pleaded. The group started to back away, but the fog seemed to close in around them, making it difficult to move. "We have to get out of here," Jenny whispered urgently. But as they turned to leave, the ghost reached out and the swings suddenly shot forward, blocking their path. Panic set in as the group realized they were trapped. The ghost's sad expression twisted into one of anger. "Why won't you play with me?" she screamed, her voice echoing across the playground. The swings began to move wildly, as if possessed by an unseen force. The ground beneath them started to shake, and the fog thickened to the point where they could barely see each other. "Run!" shouted Sarah. But it was too late. The ghost lunged at them, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. They tried to flee, but the fog made it impossible to find their way. The group stumbled through the fog, disoriented and terrified. The ghost's laughter echoed around them, growing louder and more menacing. "You can't leave," she taunted, her voice coming from every direction. "You promised to play with me." Mark tripped over a root and fell to the ground, scraping his knee. As he tried to get up, he felt a cold hand grab his ankle. He screamed as he was dragged back towards the swings. The others tried to help, but the fog was too thick, and the ghost's laughter drowned out their cries for help. They were all trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Sarah, determined to save her friends, grabbed a large stick and swung it at the fog, hoping to hit the ghost. "Leave us alone," she shouted. For a moment, the laughter stopped and the fog began to lift. The ghost appeared in front of her, looking sad and confused. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The ghost's eyes filled with tears. "I'm just so lonely," she said softly. "No one wants to play with me anymore." Sarah hesitated, realizing that the ghost wasn't just angry, she was hurt. But before she could say anything, the ground started to shake again and the ghost's expression turned dark. Realizing they were running out of time, Sarah quickly came up with a plan. "We'll play with you," she said, trying to sound calm. "But first, we need to get our other friends. Can you let us go?" The ghost seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. "But you have to promise," she said, her voice filled with desperation. The group nodded quickly, eager to escape. The fog began to lift, and the swing slowed down. The ghost stepped back, allowing them to pass. "Remember your promise," she warned as they ran towards the exit. "I'll be waiting." The group didn't stop running until they were far away from the playground. They collapsed in a heap, gasping for breath. "We made it," Mark said, relief flooding through him. But the memory of the ghost's sad eyes haunted them. They knew they couldn't go back on their promise, but they also knew they could never return to that playground. As they walked home, they heard the faint sound of laughter behind them, carried on the wind. The ghost's presence lingered in their... The school's locker room was always a bit eerie, especially when it was empty. Students often complained about the strange noises they heard when they were alone, but no one took it seriously. That was until a group of students decided to investigate the rumors. They had heard stories about a shadowy figure that lurked in the locker room, appearing only when someone was alone. The tales varied from harmless pranks to terrifying encounters, but they were curious and wanted to see for themselves if there was any truth to the stories. So, one afternoon, they stayed behind after practice. As they entered the locker room, the air was thick with humidity, and the smell of sweat lingered. The lights flickered as they walked down the rows of lockers, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Tom, glancing nervously around. "It's just a locker room," replied Jake, trying to sound confident. But as they reached the back of the room, a sudden chill ran through the air, causing them all to shiver. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, they saw a dark figure standing at the end of the row. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone. The group exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they had really seen something or if it was just their imagination. "Did you guys see that?" whispered Lisa, her voice trembling. "It was just a shadow," said Jake, though he didn't sound convinced. They continued to explore, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Every time they turned a corner, they felt like they were being watched. Suddenly, they heard a loud bang, followed by the sound of lockers slamming shut. "What was that?" Tom asked, his heart pounding. They turned to look, and there it was again. The shadowy figure, this time much closer. The shadowy figure seemed to move with the flickering lights, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. "We need to get out of here," said Lisa, backing away slowly. But as they turned to leave, the figure blocked their path. It was tall and featureless, a dark mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. The group was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. The figure moved closer, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "What is that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. No one had an answer, but they all knew one thing. They had to escape, and fast. The shadowy figure began to advance, its movements slow and deliberate. The group snapped out of their trance and bolted towards the exit, their footsteps echoing through the empty locker room. The figure followed, its form shifting and distorting as it moved. The lights flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows that made it hard to see. "Run faster," shouted Tom, but the figure was gaining on them. The door to the locker room seemed impossibly far away, and the air grew thick with fear. They could feel the figure's presence right behind them, its cold, dark energy closing in around them. Just as they reached the exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "No!" cried Lisa, pounding on the door in desperation. The shadowy figure was right behind them, blocking any chance of escape. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls warping and twisting in the dim light. "We're trapped," whispered Jake, his voice filled with despair. The figure moved closer, its form growing larger and more menacing with each step. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. They could feel the figure's cold breath on their necks, and the air was thick with tension. They had to think fast if they wanted to survive. Tom, trying to keep his composure, grabbed a metal rod from one of the lockers and swung it at the figure. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice shaking, but the rod passed right through the figure. As if it were made of smoke, the figure loomed over them, its presence filling the room with an oppressive darkness. "We need to find another way out," said Lisa, her voice trembling, but there was no other exit. They were trapped in the locker room with the shadowy figure, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. As they backed away from the figure, Jake noticed something strange. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was casting a shadow of its own. "Wait," he said, pointing to the floor. "Look at that." The others followed his gaze and saw the faint outline of a shadow on the floor beneath the figure. "It's real," whispered Lisa, her voice filled with horror. "It's not just a ghost." The realization sent a wave of terror through the group. The figure wasn't just a supernatural entity. It was something far worse. It was alive, and it was hunting them. Desperate to escape, the group frantically searched for a way out. Jake noticed a vent in the corner of the room. "There," he shouted, pointing to it. They quickly pried it open and began to crawl through the narrow space. The figure followed, its form shifting and distorting as it squeezed through the vent. The air was thick with fear, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "Hurry!" shouted Tom. But the vent was long and winding, and the figure was gaining on them. They could feel its cold breath on their necks as they crawled faster and faster. Just as they thought they couldn't go any further, they reached the end of the vent. They tumbled out into the school's basement, gasping for air. The figure was right behind them, its dark form filling the room with an oppressive presence. "We have to get out of here," said Lisa, her voice trembling. They ran towards the exit, but the figure was close behind. As they reached the door, Jake turned to face the figure, determined to stop it. But as he did, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving behind only a cold, empty space. The group stood in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had escaped, but the memory of the shadowy figure would haunt them forever. Room 104 at Maplewood High had a reputation that made even the bravest students uneasy. The room, once a regular classroom, had been sealed off years ago after a tragic incident. Legend had it that a student named Emily had mysteriously disappeared during class right in front of everyone's eyes. Despite thorough investigations, she was never found. After the incident, the school decided to close off the room, and it remained locked ever since. But strange things started happening. Students reported hearing voices, footsteps, and seeing flickering lights coming from inside. Curiosity got the better of a group of friends who decided to sneak in one night. The group of friends, Alex, Mia, Jake, and Sophie, waited until the school was empty before making their move. The hallway leading to room 104 was eerily quiet, and the only light came from the dim emergency lights. "Are you sure about this?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "It's just a room," Alex replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. With a few quick moves, they managed to pick the lock. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, dusty classroom. The air inside was cold, much colder than the rest of the school, and it smelled of old chalk and mildew. "Let's make this quick," Jake said as they stepped inside, closing the door behind them. As they explored the room, it became clear that something was wrong. The desks were still arranged as if waiting for students, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. "It's like no one's been in here for years," Sophie whispered. Suddenly the lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows on the walls. "Did you see that?" Jake asked, pointing to the corner of the room. The others turned to look and saw a faint outline of a figure standing in the shadows. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving them all on edge. "Maybe we should leave," Mia suggested, but Alex shook his head. "We came this far. Let's at least see what's in the closet." The closet in room 104 was notorious for being where Emily had disappeared. No one had opened it since that day. Alex cautiously approached it, the others following closely behind. The handle was cold to the touch, sending a shiver down his spine. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pulled the door open. Inside, they found a small, cramped space filled with old textbooks, broken chairs, and a diary. "What's this doing here?" Sophie asked, picking up the dusty book. As she opened it, the pages began to flutter, as if being flipped by an invisible hand. The room suddenly felt much colder, and a soft whisper filled the air. "Help me." Sophie began to read the diary out loud. It was Emily's diary, and the entries described strange occurrences leading up to her disappearance. She wrote about hearing voices, feeling watched, and seeing shadowy figures in the room. The final entry was especially chilling. "I don't know who or what it is, but I'm scared. I feel like something terrible is going to happen. If I disappear, please know that I didn't leave willingly. It's here, and it's coming for me." As Sophie finished reading, the lights flickered more violently and the temperature dropped even further. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice filled with fear. As they turned to leave, the door to the room slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone. The shadows in the room began to move, forming a dark, menacing figure in the center of the room. It was tall, featureless, and exuded an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure started to advance towards them and the air grew thick with fear. "Stay together," Alex shouted. But the figure seemed to distort the space around them, making it hard to see or move. The whispers grew louder, turning into anguished cries for help. "It's Emily!" Mia screamed, realizing that the figure was the ghost of the missing girl. The ghost of Emily seemed to be trapped between worlds, her spirit twisted by fear and anger. She reached out to them, her face a mask of pain. "Help me," she moaned, her voice filled with despair. The group huddled together, unsure of what to do. "We have to find a way to release her," Sophie said, her voice trembling. But the ghost's presence was overwhelming, and they were running out of time. The lights flickered violently, and the room started to shake as if an earthquake was hitting. Desks and chairs were flung across the room by an unseen force, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. "We need to find something to calm her spirit," Alex suggested, but they were at a loss for what to do. Amidst the chaos, Jake noticed something shining in the corner of the room. It was a small, silver locket, half buried under a pile of dust. He picked it up and opened it, revealing a picture of a young girl, Emily. "This must have been hers," Jake said, holding it up for the others to see. The moment they touched the locket, the ghost froze, her form becoming more solid. "It's her locket," Sophie realized. "She's connected to it." They quickly placed the locket on one of the desks and stepped back. The ghost reached out towards the locket, her expression softening. As she touched it, the room began to calm down. The shaking stopped, and the whispers faded into silence. Emily's ghost slowly turned to face them, her expression one of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As they watched, her form began to fade, becoming more transparent with each passing second. The oppressive feeling in the room lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. The group stood in silence, watching as Emily's ghost slowly disappeared, leaving behind only the faintest echo of her presence. "She's finally at peace," Mia said softly, tears in her eyes. The room, once filled with terror, was now just an ordinary classroom again. The next morning, the group returned to room 104, unsure of what they would find. To their surprise, the door was wide open, and the room was completely empty. There were no signs of the previous night's events, no overturned desks, no shattered glass, nothing. It was as if it had all been a bad dream, but they knew it was real. They had helped Emily find peace, and in doing so, they had laid the ghost of room 104 to rest. As they left the school that day, they couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, knowing that Emily's spirit was finally free.